All right, so here we are in the second installment of disease. So we started talking about the 1918 flu pandemic, and so it wouldn't be eight-year-old history if there weren't documents. So let's go ahead and look at some documents. So our source is a medical doctor, and this is his, oh, for crying out loud, this is his letter to a friend. So we know already, because it's a letter to a friend, that he is going to be maybe a bit more upfront, a bit more honest, a bit more candid than he would be otherwise. And this is from Camp Devens in the U.S. Army base near Boston. So we already talked about how Boston was one of the outbreak areas. Right. So he says, Camp Devens has about 50,000 men, or it did before the epidemic broke loose. Ooh, ominous. The epidemic started about 4 weeks ago and has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized and all ordinary work is held up till it has passed. Sounds like our life. All assemblages of soldiers are taboo. We've been averaging about 100 deaths a day and still keeping it up. The normal number of doctors here is about 25, and that has been increased to over 250, all of whom have temporary orders. The little town nearby is quite a sight. It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days, there were no coffins, and the bodies piled up something fierce. We used to go down to the morgue and look at the boys laid out in rows. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. Right? And I think that really supports, in terms of effects, right, that 16 million people die in World War One, and the number we talked about in the last one of between 30 and 50 million people die in the flu. So, wow. And you can imagine what the paperwork alone is fierce. And the government demands all the paperwork be kept up in good shape. So you can see that we are busy. So if we're talking about effects, here we're talking about, right, the disruption of life, right? That you have doctors congregating, right? Doctors congregating. That you have cities dealing with the death, right? And it reminds you of the plague, where, there were so many people dying that there weren't enough people left to bury them. And then we'll go around the world. In fact, we'll go to Dar es Salaam. And this is C.T. Stoneham. He's a British soldier who serves in East Africa, about a British military base. So again, here kind of military base, and here a U.S. Army base. So we can kind of see the role that the military played in 1919. And this is from his book, Africa All Over, which he published in England in 1934. So native and Indian fundi, or skilled craftsmen, made coffins by lamplight and wondered if they themselves would occupy them. Rumors spread throughout the base that it was the end, all caps, that a god weary of war had determined to wipe humanity off the world by means of a plague more fatal than man's destructiveness. So again, this plays into this idea of war, this idea of sinfulness, right? And again, making coffins that you might need. So, right, there were no coffins and the bodies piled up, right? That this how social disruption. So Alfred Cosby, who we first learned about with the Columbian Exchange, he also wrote about the 1918 influenza pandemic. So this is from the introduction to this paper that he wrote, The Enigma. He says the disease we call influenza or flu or grippe is not one the general public particularly fears. That is odd because the only event in history that compares with the world wars of this century as a killer in terms of absolute numbers and exceeds them in the swiftness and universality of its deadly effects is the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. It killed millions of people, and it did so in less than a year. The quote Spanish flu was as it was nicknamed in 1918 killed a large number of people more rapidly than the deadliest war, not because it was lethal to the individual sufferer as a bullet or a bomb, but because it spread rapidly and affected millions of people. By a conservative estimate, a fifth of the human species suffered the fever and aches, says 1 in every 20 people. And serological evidence indicates that a great majority of those who did not suffer the discomforts of the flu had subclinical forms of the disease. So this would be your mild symptoms, right? This has such an effect, and this was the fact that I definitely wanted to include, but the average life expectancy in the United States drops by a decade because of the pandemic. So the Next part that we're going to be talking about is diseases resulting from poverty. Actually, JK. We'll talk about the impacts of disease through history, and then we'll go back and talk about diseases from poverty, maybe in the next installment. So, as you can see in this medieval image, oh Christ, in this medieval image, right? Look at all these coffins, all of the coffins. Oh, sad, right? Grave digging. We're going to talk about the plague. So, this I think we've seen before. King Edward III of England, Parliamentary Decree 1351. So the plague is the worst from 1347 to 1349 in Western Europe. So let's see what he says. I, Edward, by the grace of God, King of England, sent this decree to the Sheriff of Kent. A great portion of the people of our realm have recently died. Why have they died? Oh my gosh, they've died of the plague. Those who survive see that masters need servants, which are scarce, and the servants will not serve. Sorry. Unless they receive excessive wages. So what is an effect of the plague? Is an increase in wages. After consulting with the nobles and the clergy, oh my gosh, it's like the first two estates, we have decided that every man and woman of our realm of England shall be required to serve his or her lord that at the wages that were provided in 1346. Oh, bummer. Merchants, those who belong to craft guilds, and those who own their land are exempt from this rule. The lords are entitled to keep their serfs, right? And we know that another one of the effects of the plague in Europe is the death not only of millions of people, but the death of feudalism. So this is starting to hint at that. Let's look at a graph because again, AP World History. So we have this is actually hectares of land cultivated for agriculture. And a hectare is about 2.5 acres. So in China, in the year 1200, we have 55, and I think it's in millions, 55.2. Then by 1300, it is gone down. So one of the things that that indicates is the introduction of champa rice and the fact that it is more efficiently grown. And then it goes down again, right? And this is plague. Let's look at Europe. We have 71, so more land in production. This is because it is less efficient than in China. Grows dramatically. A lot of this is agricultural things like three crop rotation, the horse collar, right? So we have some new technologies being put in place. And then, oh my gosh, it's a 26-point drop. And this is the plague, right? And what are the impacts of that economically, socially? That so much land stops being in production, that there's that much less to eat, right? So in India, we see kind of a mild decrease. And again, in the Middle East, we see a mild decrease. So we can definitely use that information, that data, in order to inform us of who is most deeply impacted by the plague. And while everyone feels an impact, Europe is most definitely experiencing the worst. So then let's see if I can erase this. Of course, it's like the first thing that I wrote. This, I think, yeah, this just highlights. Okay, you'll have to bear with me. I don't normally use Keynote, but this is what seems to work the best. All right, so we are transitioning away from the plague for a second because I want to talk about disease through history. So the inhabitants of the New World were the bearers of no serious infection transferable to the European and African populations that intruded upon their territory, whereas the abrupt confrontation with the long array of infections that European and African populations had encountered piecemeal some 4,000 years provoked a massive demographic disaster among the Amerindians. What is that massive demographic disaster, right? In your textbook, it's referred to as the Great Dying, right? That's a combination of smallpox, right? I think this one, mostly smallpox. And here is from a native source. In the course of the 5th year, 1519, the terrible pestilence began. First there was cough, then blood. The number of deaths at this time was truly terrible. In 1520, the pestilence spread. Truly, the number of deaths among the people was terrible, and the people could not escape the pestilence. In 1521, my father, King Hung, died. The elders and the priests alike died from the pestilence. Half the people threw themselves into the ravines to escape it. Right? What are the effects of this? Right? And it's that Spain destroys empires. Right? So when we think about the social disruption, even the political and the economic disruptions of disease, right? This is what we were talking about. The role that disease plays throughout history is really tremendous.